thanks to everybody for showing up on this, David. I'm happy to say that our grand rounds will be exciting and warm everyone up this morning. So I want to thank Johnson and Johnson and Novartis for being here on this Monday morning to support our education and research. And I'm happy to introduce my colleague and partner, Dr. Siu-Hin, who will be speaking to us this morning on his topic about artificial intelligence. He is an advanced heart failure specialist over in our United campus, has a long history of research and education work in advanced heart failure, has given us 2 previous grand rounds, one in January on amyloidosis and one back in May on how to build a team from his travel experience. And now he's a little bit of background information for you all. He also just recently received his MBA from the Carlson School and in May, and congratulations for that. And with that knowledge that he's gained there in his heart failure, he's going to talk to us this morning on artificial intelligence and how we might apply that to our work. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharkey, for that kind introduction. And I'd just like to start by talking about a bit of my story and why today I'm talking about artificial intelligence. A lot of you know me as the heart failure person, so this is a different topic. But I would like to start with a story and a little bit of a background about how I came to be interested in artificial intelligence and why I'm talking about it today. I have no disclosures except some of the things that I will mention today, such as applications, are ones that I use every day, either in my professional or personal life. So let's start with a story as to how I came to become interested in artificial intelligence and why I'm talking about AI today. I'm from Hong Kong, which is a city of fusion. It's a city of combining things. And that has really shaped my perspective growing up. When my parents and I immigrated to the United States, it was a period of change. And change is also a theme in my life and how it leads into my educational endeavors. So I studied biomedical engineering in undergrad, went on to study medicine at Northwestern University, and subsequently got interested in cardiology because of all the research and clinical care. I was at Mayo Clinic for my clinical and research education in cardiology. And subsequently, just recently, I completed a degree in business management, which sounds completely different, but these are all ways in which I view the world differently. The idea here is that these are different lenses or different viewpoints by which we view the world, and it helps me become a better clinical cardiologist. It also helps me gain a better understanding of the healthcare arena. So with these ideas in my background, the idea of combining things, the idea of change, and the idea of endless curiosity, this idea that we want to view the world differently, these are really the themes that fit with artificial intelligence and why I became interested in it. So the objectives today, by the end of this talk, I hope to introduce different artificial intelligence applications in cardiology and how they offer real value. I would like to talk about bottlenecks and what is a cardiovascular patient journey. The idea that artificial intelligence is not all just hype and it's not randomly deployed, but rather it's important to think about the pathway and where along the journey that we intelligently deploy AI. And finally, I'd like to introduce the ideas of opportunities and how to best integrate artificial intelligence into clinical workflows. So I'll pause a bit here, and I would like to ask you, the audience. I see a wide variety of backgrounds in the audience, a lot of clinical cardiologists, and I'd like to ask you how you utilize artificial intelligence either in your personal life or in your professional life. So John, if we can go ahead and turn on the mic, thank you very much. So please, yeah, just I just kind of want to hear a little bit about how you guys use AI.
I'll use ChatGPT randomly to start trip planning or look for restaurants in a new city. Nothing to do with cardiology, but that's pretty much all that I do from an AI standpoint. I've heard of the other applications in Epic. I haven't used them yet, but
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so maybe tell me a little bit, how do you use it in travel? Like, for example, what would you do?
like for instance, plan a 3-day itinerary to Paris. What would you do in Paris? List some things with food, with adventure, with culture, and then see what it comes up with.
Yeah, and do you find it helpful? Do you find it
It's a nice framework for sure to start, and some of it kind of, is pretty commonly found with Google too. It's just a lot faster when it puts it all together very, very quickly.
Wonderful. So fast and
Yeah.
efficient. That's
Yeah.
one of the big themes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Other ideas or other ways in which people use artificial intelligence in your lives?
I find it kind of like reading a review. If you have a complex idea and you're trying to synthesize that idea, instead of searching through 20 papers, you can get an AI summary that gives you a good direction. It might not be completely accurate, but it gives you a good direction to know, where to explore your topic.
Okay, wonderful. So the things I'm hearing is that it helps partly be more efficient, just like our Paris trip planning. It probably helps you become more focused and is able to organize and summarize things efficiently. Okay, I'm also hearing maybe able to help brainstorm some ideas, right, and come up with creative things. Okay, wonderful. Anyone else? Maybe one more about how people use AI.
It helps me in writing. I'm Hispanic, so I still, although I've been here for almost 30 years, I still probably the structure, my grammatical structure is in Spanish. And so I tend to mix, the verbs or the articles like off and in and out and things like that. And so it helps me correct my English.
Wonderful. So you use it kind of as a tool to help you be more accurate and check.
Oh, yeah.
That's wonderful. And Dr. Sharkey?
I've been a big fan of Open Evidence, which is an artificial intelligence platform for asking all sorts of questions because it offers evidence of where it's getting its recommendation and cites literature in an accurate way.
Absolutely. So Dr. Sharkey, thank you for mentioning that. Open evidence, that's one of the things we'll talk about more today. And that's one of the, I think, the important take-home points is that by the end of today, I hope to introduce some specific examples. I want to talk about how I integrate artificial intelligence in my professional life and how we'll talk about efficiency, we'll talk about quality and accuracy. And then at the end of it, I also want to make an argument. I think we're all very concerned that artificial intelligence will replace us, right? We'll all be out of jobs. And this argument has happened, many different times, throughout the time period of when the internet came about. Is that going to replace everyone? The argument that I'm going to make is, one, artificial intelligence is not going to replace cardiologists and physicians. But at the same time, I will say that those who use artificial intelligence well and understand it will replace those who don't adapt, who don't change, who don't embrace it, because artificial intelligence is the future. And finally, the biggest and the most controversial argument I will make is that artificial intelligence will actually bring back some of the joy in our lives. I think that is right, right? So I'm going to try and make the argument by the end of today how AI can do that for us. Yes. All right. So before I kind of dive into specific examples about artificial intelligence in our lives, I would like to start with two broad concepts that I'm going to go back to again and again. So the first concept here is that what is artificial intelligence, right? So artificial intelligence is the idea that machines can have the ability and utilize things that we generally associated with human intelligence. So things like reasoning, things like learning, things like problem solving, right? But artificial intelligence does not replace humans. It doesn't think the same way as we do. In the age of the internet, we have all this human knowledge placed online and we have all this data, right? And with machine learning, the idea is that it looks for patterns. It's looking for patterns and it's able to use that pattern to also predict the next step in the sequence, the idea of generative AI. So it's not really creating something new. It's not thinking in the same logical thinking process as humans, but the idea is that it can predict something based on all the patterns that it sees. Now, in fact, to be really accurate, right, if we think about all the knowledge out there, if we really want something that is accurate, the more guardrails and the more guidelines that we give in our prompts for artificial intelligence, when we're talking about large learning models such as ChatGPT or Gemini, when we're interacting with it, when we give AI guidelines, it actually makes this response better. So one suggestion here is when you interact, when you're typing into or speaking to a large language learning model, okay? So that would be something like ChatGPT or something like Gemini or Grok. The idea is you want to define the persona for your model, right? So you may start with something like, you are a cardiologist. In my situation, I might start with saying, you are a heart failure cardiologist. So you start with defining a persona, then you ask it the question, right? That limits the data set with which artificial intelligence gathers from. And therefore, it actually makes your response more accurate because you are interested in what other cardiologists are thinking, not necessarily what the general population is thinking. This is the idea of hallucinations, right? You can come up with something that's incorrect. So it's always important for a human to check it, right? Because there could be a lot of misinformation out there. It's just gathering information from the internet. It's gathering information from human knowledge. And it does, artificial intelligence doesn't necessarily verify it. You can ask it to, where did you get your sources, and go through that, but that requires a human to analyze. At this current time, so the idea is we're in an age of weak AI. Some people believe that in the future, this is also controversial, we'll get to artificial general intelligence, which is basically AI at the level of humans, how we think, and artificial superintelligence, the idea that it will surpass how humans think. Think Terminator, okay, the movie, right? So we're not quite there yet, and that's a different discussion for a different time. But we're kind of in weak AI mode, where AI is very good at certain things. It's very jagged. It excels at certain things, and it's very weak in other things. And this is the Venn diagram, because we think about what tasks are really good for AI, what tasks are really good for humans, and there is that center part, right, where AI is actually a collaborator. You want to work with AI, and it can actually augment what we do. So the idea here is that the more you interact with AI in your personal lives, in planning travel, in cooking, in recipes, right, in writing, the more we interact with it, the more it learns about us, the more it's a collaborator. So we want to see AI as a friend rather than an enemy that's trying to compete with us for our jobs and our livelihoods. So this is the first big concept. The first big concept is that in the age of AI as we are now, there are tasks that AI is very good at. There are tasks that cannot replace humans. There are tasks that we're really good at. And there are also things that overlap, right, and combine, and we can collaborate and view AI as a collaborator. So as I move through this journey with you, I would like you to think about what tasks can be delegated to an AI, what tasks absolutely needs us to be in charge of in terms of humans, and what tasks, most importantly, can be augmented by artificial intelligence, and how we can integrate it into our workflow. Concept number one. Concept number two comes from business management. This is the idea of a journey and a journey map. So how does someone get from the beginning, the first step, all the way to the end? Now, you, in this case, could be the patient. So let's say the patient has a medical issue. how do they get the care? Right? They pick up the phone, they call to schedule an appointment, they come in for a visit, they get an examination, they get testing, labs, management plan, and then they execute that management plan. Okay? So that's a journey map for patients. We can think about a journey map for healthcare organizations, right? What do healthcare organizations struggle with? What are the bottlenecks, right? If we think of this as a pathway, there are certain bottlenecks along the journey, right? So this helps us intelligently identify and intelligently deploy AI. One of the issues with AI is that there's so much hype and there's so much change that it's almost this idea of fear of missing out, right? We hear about this new technology and we want to try it, we want to use it, right? And then we hear about something completely different and we want to deploy it. But the idea is, does it truly add value? And it's different in every case, right? For someone or some organization or some patient or some provider workflow, the bottleneck might be in a particular spot. For someone else, it might be different. So instead of thinking about the solution first and what AI tools we have, I challenge you to think about what problems you have first, and then intelligently find the right AI tool to be deployed at that bottleneck to relieve that bottleneck. And that will improve the overall flow. Because there are a lot of clinical cardiologists here, the next portion of the talk, I'm going to go into specifically about tools that we can use to improve our own workflow. And again, at the end, make the argument that it could actually improve enjoyment in our lives. So two big concepts. We had the Venn diagram concept and the delegation, augmentation, and what's important for humans, and then thinking about a journey. So we'll start with a journey to a day in my life in clinic, right? And what the potential opportunities for deployment of AI are, and what the potential bottlenecks can be. So challenges often come even before going into a patient's room during clinic, right? How do we obtain all the information? How do we understand the patient, the background? How do we document well, right? I remember when I was training that we would pick up a phone at the end of a clinic visit, right, and dictate. And there would be someone on the other, it would go into recording, there would be someone on the other end of that phone, right, and type up a note. And they have human reasoning, so that it's very nice, because if I skip back and forth, the human will kind of understand where to place those components. Is it in the history? Is it in the physical? Is it in the assessment and plan? Then we transitioned into the age of dictation, dragon dictation. We dictate into the microphone at the end of a visit, and for those of us, particularly that don't type very quickly, it's very helpful and saves us a lot of time. But there are also challenges too. There are challenges about accuracy. We've all struggled, right, with dictating the wrong words. Sometimes we have probably all seen notes that don't make a lot of sense because there are extra words inserted. Sometimes it actually is the opposite of what you intended. Now we're at the age where documentation can be augmented with artificial intelligence. Right, so have any of you guys used DAX Copilot? Dr. Ekman, I see you raise your hand. Dr. Ekman, how do you feel, how do you enjoy using DAX Copilot? Do you find it helpful?
No. But I think it has strong potential. So I used it, and it's well designed for if you had at least in some of this maybe that I just hadn't learned to use it. If you show up to your primary care and say, I have a sinus infection, or here's my symptoms, and you go through a very focused event, it's able to synthesize that. What I wanted it to do was basically transcribe or summarize the discussion I have with the patient as the history of present illness. But then what I use for an assessment plan is somewhat templated. And it would choke, and it made my notes worse, and I had to do so much editing that I gave up on it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your perspective, Dr. Ekman. To be honest, I was exactly like you when I first started. And I still, in my clinical practice, I use DAX Copilot sporadically. I don't use it for every single patient visit. But just like Dr. Ekman, I struggled so much when I first started using it. I was so excited when it was announced for Lina, and I was, early, I wanted to try it, right? And I'm a relatively fast typer, so I found it actually made my visits longer, right? I had to go back and edit and reorganize, and I can type pretty quickly while I'm in the room, right? So it actually took me a long time to really force myself to adopt it. And that initial investment actually took a lot of time. And Dr. Ekman highlighted a lot of the struggles. It doesn't really write the note like we would want to, right? First of all, I'd like to credit Dr. Ritu Saxena. She is a power user of some of these AI tools. So a lot of these I learned kind of from her ideas too. I ask her how she uses it and how she makes it better, right? I would say more recently, I have used DAX Copilot a bit more. So again, DAX Copilot, for those of you who don't use it, it's an ambient dictation note summarizing tool, basically. So you turn it on when you enter the room with the patient. It listens to everything, and then it generates a note, right? So I don't have to type it and look at the computer when I'm in the room with the patient. I can focus on speaking with the patient. And at the end of it, though, there are many challenges as how it is now because it sometimes hallucinates. It may give us information that's not accurate, so you have to make sure to remove it. It gives us extraneous stuff, right? For those of us who, in heart failure or in specialty medicine, maybe we are not as concerned about other conditions. We want to focus on what's relevant. What I've found to be helpful with customizing DAX Copilot is that you can actually edit inside the app. So there are these dot phrases that we can put in the note, in the history section, in the assessment section, and then you can actually open up that section in the DAX Copilot or Copilot framework. If you edit there, it will learn how you want it. So the more you use it, the more it gets better. You can actually customize it as well. So now I've customized it as my primary specialty to be heart failure, my secondary specialty to be cardiovascular disease. And you can also choose how you want your wording, right? So this changes every day. And that's why I don't want to necessarily spend a huge amount of time today talking about the details exactly of how to do these things, because it might be different next week compared to today. But I think the concept is, one, the more you use it, the better it gets. And second is the more you customize it. It takes a lot of effort in the beginning to customize it, to tell it how you want. For example, I've told it kind of, I want it to be more simple language. You can ask it to be more formal language, right? You can ask it to be really, really simple language so that patients can look at it and understand it. So you can customize it many ways. You can customize your template. Do you want bullet points? Do you want sentences? So the idea is the more you use it, again, the better it gets. And I still don't use DAX Copilot on every single patient encounter. For return visits, for example, I find that I'm faster doing it myself, right? But for new patients, I've often found that it saves me time. It is, in a sense, more accurate because sometimes there are things I forget, particularly if I don't do the note immediately. So it might pick up parts of the history that I didn't even remember, right, that the patient talked about. And then finally, I think the important part is I can focus on the patient. I'm not typing on the computer. I'm not focusing on orders while I'm talking and listening and doing all these things. So in a sense, it does bring back some of the joy, I think, because we don't necessarily enjoy every aspect, right, of a clinic visit. There are things like documentation that we have to do, but that's not why we went into medicine in the first place. So the idea is by delegating certain things to AI or having AI help us and augment things, then we can focus on why we went into medicine in the first place. And in that sense, it brings back some of the joy. It likely improves patient satisfaction. For me, I'm able to directly focus on the patient rather than focusing on all these other things. So that's one example, the DAX Copilot ambient note dictation tool, even before doing anything else, just kind of augmenting the way in which we are able to interact with patients. So then we have how artificial intelligence is able to help us in terms of analyzing data. Right? So Dr. Peter Noseworthy from the Mayo Clinic gave a grand rounds talking about artificial intelligence and EKGs, and how from EKGs we are able to pick up many different signals that humans would otherwise not be able to pick up. The idea of pattern recognition, right? That's a really good, strong part of artificial intelligence. So here, if we think about how artificial intelligence is able to help us be a better diagnostician, right? How it's able to integrate data. Maybe it's the EKG, like Dr. Noseworthy described. Maybe it's echocardiography or imaging. That's one of the big fears, right? Is artificial intelligence going to replace radiologists? In 2018, I wrote, as a fellow at the Mayo Clinic, I wrote this short piece about the future of echocardiography. And it was with Dr. Vera Reglan from Northwestern University, and we envision, right, how echo can evolve and how we can be more efficient, how we can become more precise, how we can improve ergonomics. This was a sketch that I drew in 2017, right? So almost 10 years ago, looking at what potential things we can do to improve echocardiography and improve efficiency. So for example, at the top, I envision changing the interface, right? So rather than this trackball that we still use on our echo machines, what if we use a stylus and a pen? Wouldn't that be a little bit easier to trace than to trace with a trackball? What about technological upgrades? Instead of a wired probe, right? What about a wireless probe? That would make it so much easier, right, ergonomically. What about augmented reality? The idea that there could be voice recognition, that we can envision where the optimal imaging window is, right, in the body. Like, for those of you who do scan, think about this. Like when we first put down the probe, or if you're trying to teach a student, there isn't really a way. It's kind of based on your experience, right, where you put the probe to get the image. What if artificial intelligence can tell us exactly where to go, right, for the optimal image? What about post-processing? If we think about how we read echocardiography, it's a whole mishmash, basically, right, of data and images, not in any particular logical order, except how it's scanned, right? There's a general order, but it doesn't fit in our mind about logically how we think about interpreting a study, right? It doesn't group it into the left ventricle, the right ventricle, the atrium, how we generally think of our reports, right? We usually start off our reports with describing the left ventricle, then the right ventricle, then the atrium, then valves, right? The images are not presented to us in that particular order. So that's the power of humans and experience. We know generally what order sonographers utilize. We know they generally start with peristernal long axis, and then we think about which components, right, we pull out. What if artificial intelligence can do that? So that was, almost 10 years ago, kind of this idea. Most recently, last year at the American College of Cardiology conference, I was browsing in the product theater and looking at some of these tools, right, that companies that have the echocardiography machines, have the ultrasound machines, have utilized. And a lot of the science fiction stuff have actually proven to be true. So for example, at one of the booths, when there was a demonstration of scanning, on the two sides, there was actually, on one side, the ideal image, what it should look like, right? And then on the other side, it was where the sonographer was scanning. And then it would give direction on the screen. Tilt this way, tilt that way, move up, move down to get to the ideal image, right? So it knows where the optimal imaging window is. Or the tracings, right? We have AI helps us with how we trace, automatic tracings. This is a fear about artificial intelligence replacing us as echocardiographers. the idea of organizing the report, right, in a logical way rather than the way in which it was scanned. So I was really excited to see kind of a lot of these ideas and then this kind of theme of change, right, and curiosity and thinking about how we can refine the workflow, right, and how we can think about things. We're looking at where the future is, not necessarily where we are, but we're looking at where the future will be and how we can change that. So kind of the idea of change, the idea of combining things, the idea of curiosity. What about artificial intelligence for helping us diagnose? So as we move through my clinic workday, right? This is my workflow. So we talked about ambient dictation and how that could be very powerful. Now we move on to diagnosis. So I've collected the data. I have the history, the exam, the imaging findings, and how artificial intelligence can augment or help with those. Now we're at the diagnosis portion. And this is what Dr. Sharkey mentioned in terms of open evidence. I use open evidence a lot. I used to use a lot of other tools, like I would search for information. UpToDate has been a very huge part, I think, of all of our workflow. Open evidence is basically a large language learning model, so it's like ChatGPT, but it utilizes a data set that it gathers from are from studies, right? That's what we based our decision making on. So one of the nice things about open evidence is that just like ChatGPT or Gemini, you get a response, but then it would give you the references and where it pulled from, or the guidelines and where it pulled from. So this is kind of going back to the beginning when we talked about you sometimes get results that are more accurate or more relevant to what you want when you put on more guide rails. And for open evidence, the guide rails it's evidence, right? It's the research. So how do I integrate something like open evidence into my workflow? So it might be a particular question about a diagnosis, right? And maybe a patient has a question asking like, with amyloid heart disease, am I more likely to have neuropathy? How likely am I to have neuropathy? What is the benefit in quantitative terms of this medication or this treatment? I can ask open evidence that. Will these medications interact? That is a great way. You can rather than doing drug interaction checker in every medication, compile all of those, put it in, right? It will be able to quickly, right, summarize what you need to know. What about symptoms? So think about this. If someone comes in with symptoms and you don't know what the diagnosis is, right? You can also use open evidence. Ask it like ChatGPT, right? A patient has these symptoms, right? These findings on test results. What is the most likely diagnosis? Now we have to be a little bit careful. So I'm very careful not to reveal any patient-specific information. So that's one of the ethical components, the bias components that we'll talk about towards the end. But by doing this, you actually have access to a wide variety of information and accurate information. It's not always right. It looks for patterns, right? But a lot of medicine is pattern recognition, right? Someone probably has had this condition before, and we are trying to look for that particular pattern. So open evidence, I integrate that a lot in my workflow in many different ways, but certainly to help with diagnosis. Recently, for those of you who follow the news, recently you may have heard about this contest they had in China, where they pitted 4 expert physicians. This was not in cardiology, this was in the field of gastroenterology, but 4 expert physicians with an artificial intelligence diagnosis system, right? And they gave these physicians were all behind masks, by the way, because nobody wanted to reveal who they actually were, but they were professors at universities. They gave both people, the professors, and also the artificial intelligence system data, history, physical, imaging findings, lab findings, and they asked for a diagnosis. And both groups came to the same diagnosis. The 4 physicians came to a a certain GI diagnosis. Artificial intelligence system did as well. It took the physicians 13 minutes as a group of 4 combined to come up with a diagnosis. It took AI 2 seconds to find it. Same thing, okay? So is it absolutely right? Can you rely completely? Is it going to replace us? No, because at the end of the day, we still need our judgment and our thinking, right? Because AI can hallucinate. But it can be a lot more efficient, right? I think that's one of the things that was brought up at the beginning, right? Plan a trip, it can be more efficient, right? So it can help us become more efficient and potentially more accurate, but more efficient. And we have to check as humans whether or not we believe it's accurate. What about the execution of a treatment plan? So here, as a heart failure cardiologist, guideline-directed medical therapy is a huge part of what we do. Can artificial intelligence help us with this or in the execution of a treatment plan, not only the development of a treatment plan? So if we think about adjustment or titration of guideline-directed medical therapy, a lot of it is based on pattern recognition, right? We get a phone call from the patient. The patient perhaps calls our nurse. They have a change in weight, change in the lab value, change in symptoms, and shortness of breath or in swelling. And we generally make a change to their medication. We increase their furosemide, right? Or we add metolazone, right? So a lot of it is pattern recognition. So if we think about the data coming in, and there are huge advances, by the way, in that area in terms of how we collect data. There are these heart failure devices, right? Such as CardioMEMS. If we think about, we can collect a ton of data about how patients are doing. Even blood pressure cuffs and scales are all linked, right? By Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, we can have huge amounts of data, right? How do we sort through that data? That is a pattern thing, right? And that is one thing that is very useful that could be delegated to AI or that could be augmented by AI. How we respond to that data is also a pattern recognition thing. Generally, right? Based on our experience, we may double the diuretic dose. There's generally a sequence of things that we can do. So if we think about everything from the collection of data to how we interpret it to the change in the management plan, all of those are patterns, and all of those can be augmented by AI. Now, do we have currently a perfect system to do this in heart failure? No. But do I think we're getting there? We have the components necessary for AI to really help us with guideline-directed medical titration? Yes. Think about insulin, right? How did we used to give insulin for diabetic patients? How do we give insulin now? What about with a Dexcom device? You put it on, it monitors the insulin level, right? It monitors the blood sugar. It adjusts the insulin level in which it delivers. Think about the AI opportunities there, okay? So just something to think about. This is not something I use in my daily workflow, but this is a curiosity and the potential where we're going towards in the future, how we can use AI to help us with guideline-directed medical therapy or medication titration in general, for that matter, not necessarily in heart failure. So this image highlights the importance of flow, right? And how we improve workflow. So if we think about, for example, I talked about the workflow for myself or for a clinical cardiologist in a clinical day, how we can delegate tasks to artificial intelligence, how we can use artificial intelligence to augment what it is that we do, and how there are certain things that we as physicians are really good at, the emotional connection, the explaining, the talking with patients, the empathy part. That is where I think a lot of us, the reason why a lot of us went into medicine in the first place, and that's where a lot of it can be reclaimed if we're able to delegate some of these other tasks that's really good, that AI excels at. It's very efficient, it's very accurate, right? And then we can focus on what it is we truly care about and also we truly enjoy. Now, to transition a bit from an organizational standpoint, So that first part spent the majority of the time talking about a clinical cardiologist workflow. Here we talk about an organizational workflow. So a healthcare organization struggles a lot with many different things. It could be hospital readmissions, it could be different metrics like mortality, it could be the flow and access for patients to clinic. So how do we identify spheres where artificial intelligence is able to help us? We talked a lot about efficiency, right, and time and how it can save time. We talked about accuracy too. It can pick up patterns that perhaps we don't see and we're not able to understand. I think most importantly though, aside from the efficiency and the accuracy, we talked about how it can bring us joy by focusing on things that we're really good at. So from an organizational standpoint, the important thing is to see how all these pieces come together. We talked about, is it efficiency? Is it the goal of the organization to improve efficiency, right? To decrease costs? Is it to improve quality of care? Is it to improve access, right? And the nice thing about artificial intelligence is that the answer is yes. Usually it's a trade-off, it's a scale, right? If you think about you cut costs, right? Generally you decrease quality, right? Or you improve quality, it's gonna cost more, right? But artificial intelligence is one thing that it could maybe help with all of the above, right? Isn't that a very exciting thing? I like to think about organizational workflow and areas where artificial intelligence can help by dividing it into 3 parts. That center part, that center lane, is clinical augmentation. We already talked at length about how it can improve our workflow. But there are also 2 other very important parts that begin even before we dive into the clinician, right? On the left side, it's administrative augmentation. So the idea of scheduling. How do we currently schedule? Patients call in, they wait on the phone for a little bit or for a long bit, right? They speak with someone, they get placed somewhere, which may or may not be the most appropriate person to see the patient for their condition, right? And it's very inefficient. It contributes to the problem of access to healthcare for patients. So the idea is, what if AI can help with both efficiency and quality? It can speed things up so patients don't have to wait that long to get an appointment, and it can make sure patients go to the right provider for their medical problems. How many times have we seen someone that is maybe not really having a heart problem, right? Now have to wait again. They have to be referred to pulmonology, or they have to be referred, to rheumatology. So in addition to clinical augmentation in that center lane, we have administrative augmentation on the left side. And on the right side, we have population risk prediction. This idea of how we identify patients that are falling by the wayside. So I'm very passionate about amyloid heart disease. It's one thing, how do we identify amyloid patients? Think of how many patients we identify in the echo lab. Right? It's not because they're going to clinic with symptoms. It's because we think their wall thickness is increased, right? On the echocardiogram, on their echo, or on the cardiac MRI, or in the cardiac CT, their ECV is abnormal, right? So there are population level things that we can think about in terms of how AI can augment and help us identify patients that don't have access or don't have the appropriate access to healthcare. By the way, just as a slight tangent, so we talked about my clinical workflow, the DAX Copilot, we talked about OPED evidence. The other huge component is, has any of you heard of Evidently or use Evidently? So it's built into Epic, right? It's an Epic tool, and it's an AI-powered dashboard. So the idea is I can use it from a clinical workflow standpoint because I can use Evidently to summarize what's in the chart. Think of how much time we spend digging through the chart when you get a new consultation, right? Particularly if they're not from the same healthcare system. Maybe they've had care elsewhere. Wouldn't it be nice, instead of maybe having your administrative assistant or nurse or someone dig through the chart, try and find all the information, wouldn't it be nice if you're in Epic it summarizes for you, just like we do with DAX Copilot, it can summarize a clinic visit? What if it can dig through Epic and summarize what you want to focus on? Maybe I care about the ejection fraction trend. Maybe I care about the weight, right? Maybe I care about the dosing of the medications. You can use a template and have it summarize it for you. So you can use it evidently for that. It's an AI-powered tool within Epic. You can use it from an organizational standpoint. What if I'm interested in knowing within my organization how many people have thick walls on an echocardiogram? How many people have low ejection fraction? Have we identified all of those patients? We go through those manually now. We can have physicians dig through the chart manually to do that, or we can have artificial intelligence do that quickly, accurately. It's all pattern recognition, right? So evidently, I think it's not something that we use a lot right now. It's being developed, but it's something that could help us individually as clinicians in our workflow. It's something that could certainly help organizational workflow, something that can help in research. There's a lot of potential opportunities for utilizing this tool. Okay, so we are nearing the end. We've kind of talked a lot about organizational workflow improvements and our own personal clinical workflow improvements. And I would be remiss without talking about oversight and bias and the ethics of using artificial intelligence, because I think that's on everyone's mind, right? As we rely more and more on artificial intelligence or delegate more and more tasks to artificial intelligence, how do we provide the appropriate oversight? How do we make sure, right, that a human is actually looking at this? Think about hiring. So it's a little bit outside of clinical cardiology, but how are candidates hired, right? Traditionally, you send in a resume, you go for an interview. Now, artificial intelligence is a huge part of that on both sides, right? So for candidates, artificial intelligence, AI, candidates can use it for their resume, right? Polish it, refine it, tailor it to particular organizations. Organizations can use it to actually interview patients or interview candidates, right, for jobs. So think about, doing an interview over Zoom, right? And artificial intelligence is being deployed to determine how likely is this person to be a successful employee of the organization. Do it efficiently, you can do it accurately. Think about what are the biases of that, though. Okay, so we deploy artificial intelligence and ask it, right, is this candidate going to be successful in an organization? The AI system is only as good as the data set in which it trains from. If there are intrinsic biases, right, which we know from business management, right, there are, gender biases, there are racial biases, right? If we define those, if we use it as a data set of what is successful for an organization, those biases are going to be perpetuated, right? And this is extremely important. It's the same for diagnostic purposes too. If we think about racial bias or gender bias, right, for coronary artery disease, if we only imply patterns that are out there, we only take research data that's out there, what's available, right? There are a lot of biases. So I think that's one of the huge risks with artificial intelligence is we'll have to think intelligently about how we conduct our studies, right? And that requires a lot of analytic foresight, right? You can actually ask artificial intelligence, you can ask AI when you're interacting with it to identify its own weaknesses. I think that's been one of the biggest pitfalls of a lot of the LLM models that we have used, is that those models are trained to validate what it is that you say. They're trained to make you happy, right? Not necessarily determine what's right or wrong. So I think it's very important. So one of the things, when I interact with ChatGPT, I tell it, I don't necessarily need you to validate everything that I say. I want to know what your objective opinion is about something. Right? It might be something that you don't want to hear, but it's important when thinking about biases. So you can ask AI to analyze its own thinking process, right? That is a very important part. And I do that all the time. So for example, the workflow that I talk about, I'm relatively quick at typing, right? Others may not be. So the different bottlenecks in my workflow is going to be very different than the different bottlenecks in your workflow, right? And to identify those bottlenecks, you can use AI to help augment that, right? I ask ChatGPT. I tell them I see this many patients. The type of cases are generally kind of broken down by this. I spent this much time on inboxes. How can you are an expert clinical cardiologist. How can you help me improve my workflow? And it will give a personalized, tailored plan about how you can improve your workflow. What's better than that, right? We're all different. We don't all necessarily benefit from the same tools. Same tools don't add the same value to our workflow, right? Same with organizations. You can ask it for every organization is different. So AI could be a collaborator, right, to actually help you be better at your job and find more joy in your job based on your own bottlenecks. That's going to be different for everyone. Okay, so coming back, we talked about oversight, we talked about ethics. I think this is a big part, and certainly a lot of this has to be developed from an institutional standpoint, regulatory oversight, assessing AI tools, how we use them ethically. It's a discussion, right? And I think it's a discussion with hospital committees. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but I think different viewpoints need to be brought up, right? And how, with our values, how much do we utilize AI, how we utilize it, how we analyze, and how we change it if it's providing bias, if it's not accurate, what our responsibilities are, basically. So we're nearing the end. To summarize, the augmented cardiologist, artificial intelligence, I believe, is not going to replace the cardiologist. But those who understand artificial intelligence well, those are going to replace those that don't adapt, those that don't change, and those who don't embrace it. We talked about the Venn diagram. Certain tasks can be delegated to AI. AI is jagged. It excels at certain tasks. It's weak in other tasks. Those tasks may be what is very enjoyable for us as clinicians, the emotional part, right? The empathy part. And then there is a huge part in the center where artificial intelligence can augment what we do, can make it more efficient, make it more accurate in terms of how we deliver clinical care. We talked about the journey. You remember that chutes and ladder picture, the journey about how, whether it be a patient or us as providers or organization, go through clinical care, and where we can identify the bottlenecks and deploy specific AI tools at that bottlenecks to improve workflow. In the middle part of the talk, we talked about all the examples and the clinical tools, DAX Copilot, Open Evidence, Evidently, how in each part of the workflow it can be applied. And then finally, we talked a bit about, from an organizational standpoint, how we can deploy artificial intelligence intelligently to target the blockages in the workflow. So if it's one thing I hope you take away from this talk, it is that artificial intelligence is not here to replace us. It's not our enemy. It should be thought of as a collaborator and a friend, and the idea that there are tasks that could be delegated to artificial intelligence, there are tasks that could be augmented with artificial intelligence, and then there are tasks that are best suited for us as humans. Artificial intelligence can actually help us protect and refine what it is that we value most and the reasons why we went into medicine in the first place. And if we do that, it will enhance our joy, it will enhance our value in medicine, and it will transform us into augmented cardiologists. Thank you very much.
guess I can't resist commenting. You know, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think, you know, you could tell I'm older, but you could think. So years ago, and Dr. Sharkey would know this too, they spent just thousands of man-hours developing the automated ECG pattern recognition. Dr. Hodges, who was here for years, spent a big part of his career developing those patterns. So in a way, AI is not really new. What it is that it's faster because that was all human input where somebody programmed into an ECG machine all of these patterns. So now we can program those patterns a lot faster. So I think some of the fear about this, to me, is unfounded because it's just faster. On the other hand, you'll get patients will call in and say, you know, the pharmacist told me I shouldn't take amiodarone and a beta blocker because they both slow my heart rate. And so it's sort of like, you know, the dog is biting you on the backside because obviously that pharmacist just looked in the computer and it said, you know, they both slow heart rate. And so it has its positives, but it clearly has a lot of strong negatives because of that. Best example I can give you is you make a call to some vendor, your cell phone vendor, and you have a unique problem. And it takes you through all the patterns that usually are asked. But that's the problem. You don't have the usual problem. You have a unique problem. And in order to get to a person to talk to about your unique problem, it's damn near impossible. And so then you wonder why people get really frustrated about, you know, this so-called automated intelligence, and you can understand it. Or the other thing, again, I'm a pretty healthy guy, but I get a couple of medicines that I take. And the pharmacy gives you this list of stuff, everything from your right eye might hurt to your big toe might be sore. And, you know, patients actually go home and read that stuff. And then they're calling you about, you know, all of these various side effects that, oh, by the way, maybe one person in a million somewhere in the world had that. But it comes out on that list, right? So then patients have a fear about taking the medicines that actually would be helpful to them, which is a real challenge for physicians because you're trying to explain to them, you know, well, we know they both slow your heart rate, but probably a good idea to take them, you know. So again, I'm just trying to point out the pros and the cons from an observational over many years, and I think that this actually is going to be wonderful in terms of just data synthesis and helping. I could say, you know, I used to just pick up the phone and dictate, right? And whoever was the transcriptionist did a beautiful job. You'd read them and it was just like you did it. Then they said, well, that's too expensive, Dr. Gornick, you gotta go to Dragon. Well, I'm telling you, some of my Dragon notes are really out there. I mean, they got some words in there that I don't even know where they came from, but they're in there. And you don't have the time and energy to reread everything that you're typing. I mean, it's just not feasible. So now you want to put your phone on the desk and talk to the patient and see how that works out. I haven't gone there, but a couple of my colleagues have. So again, thank you very much for synthesizing a lot of data for us.
Thank you for your thoughts. I just I'd like to comment on that. I completely agree. I think with the internet and all the research and data, a lot of artificial intelligence as it is now is really similar to in the past for pattern recognition. But like you said, now with the computer chips and all the advances in technology, we're doing it a lot faster and at a much, much larger scale. The one other thing I'd like to comment on is that I talked about the areas that we reclaim as human, right? One area that's very obvious is the emotional component, right? AI, as of this moment, can't really replace that. I think the other component right now that AI can't replace is this idea of curation. A A lot of people talk about curation or this idea of taste, having taste. So it's based on your own experience as a clinician, a master clinician, and you're able to sort through very quickly what's important and what's not, right? If you don't have experience, it may be that amiodarone and beta blockers both slow the heart rate, so that's a concern, right? But if you have experience, you've seen this before, you know this is a common question, right? You're able to weed through what's really important, what's not. And artificial intelligence, as of this moment, is not able to do that. It looks for patterns and takes into all account of this data. So I think that's still one area where we excel at and why we need to have oversight of artificial intelligence. Because it can tell us what's likely, but it doesn't have the same curation that a master cardiologist has. Can that change in the future if we get into artificial general intelligence or artificial super intelligence? Yes, because then the machine thinks in the same logical process that we do, right? We're not there yet. Some people argue whether or not we'll ever get there. But I think if we arrive at artificial super intelligence, then that will be different. It's not just the same thing faster and a bigger scale. It will completely revolutionize the way we do anything. I think there are a lot more ethical issues and also dangers associated with that. But if we ever achieve that stage where machines can think in the same process that we as humans are, it can be a little bit scary, both in terms of the possibilities. It could be used for good or it could be used for evil. Thank you so much.
I think in the interest of time, it's after 8 o'clock, and we could probably talk about this until Saturday. But I'll allow people to talk with you afterwards, and thank you very much for your presentation.